Welcome to the Sleeping Barber podcast.
People should never underestimate just how vital creative effectiveness is, not because it's effective, but because it's the only lever you can pull. It's the thing you get to control, even though it may only have 10% influence on how successful the campaign is going to be, but better 10% than 2%.
Welcome to the Sleeping Barber podcast, a place for business leaders to get the best and most credible information on marketing, strategy, and innovation. Your hosts, Marc Binkley and Vasilis Douros, share their experiences as they gather insights from the world's leading experts. Now, on with the show.
And just before we get started with this episode, V and I would love for the show to be super valuable to you. So if you could rate the podcast, leave a review, leave some feedback about who you'd like to hear about or the topics that are really important to you, that'd be great. Welcome back to the Sleeping. There's this idea that we as marketers operate on the belief that with the right strategy, the right budget, and the right creative, that brand should grow. Mm-hmm. But the reality is quite different in that the vast majority of brands don't actually grow meaningfully. And so today we're going to discuss why we do a lot of running just to stay in the same place. There's some data that we'll get into about the research that shows that an average 5-year market share gain across a few hundred brands was negligible, 0.01%. So we're bringing back Dale Harrison, who is by training a physicist and has spent time as a CFO, as a really thoughtful consultant, especially, and has done a lot of work in the B2B space. We've had him on before talking about slaying marketing sacred cows. We did a zombie metrics session with him. And today we're going to go right to the proverbial Mike Tyson quote. Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. So we're going to talk about why growth is the exception and
growth is hard.
Why growth is really hard. Yeah. Dale, welcome to the show. Thanks for jumping in and having this conversation with us.
Hey, happy to be here again.
Let's just get right to it. When you say most brands don't grow, let's start there. Because that's very controversial. What do you mean by that?
That most brands don't grow.
But so let's say this. I look at my revenue and I go, it's growing. It's up from last year.
Revenue isn't growth. So,
okay.
So the first thing is I think people need to get more precise on what their words mean. So what does growth mean? Essentially, it's going to come in two forms. You're either going to see revenue growth or market share growth. Now, 99% of the people blathering about how brands grow are talking exclusively about market share growth. Market share growth is even far rarer than revenue growth. So, if we've got 2.5% inflation, you would expect revenue growth to occur every year, even if everything else is stable, simply because everything's going up. Doesn't mean that you're actually, that you actually are taking market share or you're actually bringing in more kind of real inflation-adjusted dollars. So just because revenue is going up, or even just because it's going down, doesn't mean that that you're growing, and it doesn't mean that your market share is growing. And a good example is, if you are in a category that's growing 20% per year, so you see this a lot in tech, but you're growing 10% per year, that means you're falling behind. You should be able, if everybody is rising with the level of the lake in a growing category, your revenue growth should roughly match the growth rate of the category as a whole. So if the category is growing faster than you are, it means somebody's taking your market share. So you could see revenue growth while at the same time see market share decline. Yeah. I'll give you another example. Earlier in my marketing career, I worked for a company that was in a very, very hot category, but it was highly commoditized in the sense that that we had a set of competitors, and every competitor was producing essentially an absolutely identical product. And so we saw 100-fold growth in 5.5 years. So we went from $500,000 to $55 million in 5.5 years. At the end of that time period, we had exactly the same market share that we started with, because every one of our competitors was also growing
at the same rate
over that period of time. So, and now again, businesses don't pay their bills with, and pay their investors with market share. They pay it with revenue. So revenue growth is important, in some ways probably more important than market share growth. But you have to separate out, what are you talking about when you say growth? I'll give you another example. If we go back 25 years ago, when fax machines were once a thing and dying out, Ricoh was one of the companies that hung in there to the end. And so even though the category was shrinking radically during this period of time, because more and more competitors were exiting the category, Ricoh was taking their share. And so Ricoh was gaining significant market share year over year, even though the revenue for the product line was headed south, was headed to zero. Right. And so both of these are examples to where you can have dropping revenue and rising market share, and you can have rising revenue and market share to be stable or even declining. So that's the first thing, is to understand that revenue and market share are completely unrelated. And growth in one says nothing about growth in the other. So the question is, what are we talking about? And again, if you look at approximately 110% of everything Ehrenberg Bass talks about, it is purely about market share growth. Most of the cases where people are talking about just growth, what they really mean is market share growth. But what they point to are companies that aren't gaining market share, but are companies that are gaining revenue. And generally gaining revenue, so if you look at kind of the whole growth porn industry, all of the examples are typically either in entirely new emerging categories, or more typically in tech categories. And there, what you're seeing is you've got some technological innovation that gets introduced that radically alters the price to value ratio for solving a particular category of problem. So lots of people are coming in to purchase within that category. The category itself is growing. And then the people that, the brands that are within that category are simply, they've just been lucky enough to put their boat, to launch their boat on a rising lake. And they're all just rising with the lake level.
It kind of reminds me of like Zoom, like during COVID, a lot of the COVID brands, Zoom, Peloton, there's probably others. Those are the two that come to mind, where they had this meteoric rise and everybody was like, oh, this is amazing. And then
a better example is the NFTs.
Oh,
So NFTs went through a hockey stick growth rate, in 2021, 2022. Do you think it's because all of the crypto bros suddenly became marketing geniuses? Suddenly had amazing creative that persuaded people to pour into the crypto space. What happened was they, and likewise, it fell just as fast. So did all of those marketing geniuses in the crypto business, did they suddenly lose their mojo? What happened was you had completely external drivers that, in this case, it was essentially a fad. It was the Labubu doll of, of digital currency. You had a social fad that temporarily drove a lot of activity, and the fad died as fast as most fads do. And what happened was they simply rode the rising lake level, as it went up, and then they rode it as it went down. But it had nothing to do with marketing. And so this is what you see, is that typically growth comes from external disruptions to markets. So you have a major technological innovation.
Like the iPod was a classic example.
iPod, the classic one. I'll tell you another one was about 1940, Harvard Business School started training students in how to use spreadsheets. Except spreadsheets in those days were giant pieces of paper with grids. And you wrote numbers with a pencil in the grids and used a giant mechanical calculator to add up your columns. And so this technique had been taught in Harvard Business School, for decades. But because it was so laborious and so time consuming to be able to actually do spreadsheet analysis with a pencil and a paper and a giant mechanical calculator, very, very few people used it. Even though everyone that went through top tier MBA programs were trained in it. And in the late 70s, you had two Harvard MBA students who were also programmers who decide, and they were being taught, their homework assignments involved giant sheets of paper. And they decided it'd be a lot easier if we could just do this on our Apple II computer. And so they wrote VisiCalc and invented the electronic spreadsheet. And and then the successor was Lotus 123 on the PC. And what you saw was that by the early to mid 80s, you went from the use of spreadsheet as being extremely rare because it was a very, very high cost tool to being absolutely ubiquitous, especially, in the financial industry. And, because you suddenly had this massive 1,000-fold drop in cost to be able to use the technique. And as a result, that market absolutely exploded. And if you actually look at most of the growth of the PC hardware industry in the early to mid 1980s, after the introduction of the IBM PC, it was almost exclusively driven by spreadsheet usage. It was
funny. It just made me think of this.
PCs for the sole purpose of running Lotus 123 so they could do spreadsheet analysis.
It just made me think of this, like growing up, I haven't thought about this forever, but my dad would work on spreadsheets on paper. And every morning I wake up and there'd be pencil eraser filings all over the place.
I mean, I can't imagine what that was like. But I mean, this is an example of where a technological innovation basically blows up a category, and so you get, but it's not the marketing of the companies, of the brands within the category. It is the fact that you had a technological innovation that radically altered the price to value ratio of buying a product within that category. And so the category is exploding, and so all of the companies within it are going to see revenue growth, even though typically, even in very fast growing companies, you tend to see pretty stable market share over long periods of time.
There's a lot there, and I want to make sure I unpack just a couple things before we move on. First of all, I blame Gary V for the NFT rise and fall. He was all over it up front, and he made a big stink about it. So I think he has a share of blame in there. But you talked about a little bit on the price to value ratio, and I think it'd be good if we just quickly unpack that before we kind of get further down the conversation, if you don't mind, Dale.
Yeah, I mean, a great example is to look at the introduction of the iPod. So Apple did not invent the digital music player. That category had been around for years. It certainly did not invent portable music. That category had been around literally decades before the iPod was introduced. It had been around for more than 25 years at that point. But, the typical product, if we go back to 2001 when the iPod was introduced, the typical products on the market were either portable cassette players like the Walkman, portable CD players like Sony Discman, which dominated the market.
It was awesome.
Or the first generation of MP3 players like the Rio from Creative, and so typically those products were in the $200 to $300 range. So the Rio was about $200, the Discman was $300. Most of these players were in that range. But what was common about all of these was that none of them could carry more than 10 songs. You had 10 songs on a cassette, you had 10 songs on a CD, and the Rio was engineered to be able to only hold 10 songs because they were basically cutting corners on memory. And their thinking was, no other player holds more than 10 songs, so we don't need to hold more than 10 songs, so we can come in with a cheaper price. But they never really got great traction. And then Apple comes along. They launched their product at $400, so twice the cost of any other MP3 on the market, and a third more expensive than the leading product, which was the Discman. But and their tagline wasn't, we have a collection of electronic parts in plastic that we can sell you for $400. Their tagline was 1,000 songs in your pocket, because what Apple understood, and this was good marketing, what Apple understood is that people were not buying a bag of electronic components in plastic and injection molded parts. They were buying songs in their pocket, and at $400 with 1,000 songs in your pocket, it was 75 times cheaper in terms of the cost per song in your pocket to buy an iPod than it was to buy a Discman or a Rio. And what happened was within 4 years, within the product replacement cycle for their competitor products, they took 95% market share. So they basically just drained drain the other categories to zero. So, and what you saw there was that the entire world didn't rush out and buy an iPod day one, but as their existing products died over the subsequent 4 or 5 years, there was a high likelihood that they would not replace their dead Discman with another Discman. They would replace it with an iPod.
What you're talking about reminds me of, we had a conversation with Tony Ulwick, Jobs to be Done, outcome-driven innovation, of that sort of fame. I remember there was a thing that he had said for brands to really grow, for companies to really grow, they need to solve kind of what you were talking about. He put a number on, I think it was 15% cheaper, but the same or better service. Like they can solve a problem customers need for 15% cheaper, I think was the number that he had put out there. But either way, it kind of speaks to that price to value ratio.
But it doesn't have to be cheaper. It can be a lot more expensive.
So if you're listening and thinking your brand could benefit from reaching our audience, let's talk. We're heading into year 5 and looking for partners who want to connect with senior marketers across North America, the UK, and Australia. There's lots of integration options that can range from host-read inserts like this one to in-person features at events like the Cannes Lions. Connect with V or I on LinkedIn and let us know you're interested in exploring what a partnership could look like. All right, back to the conversation.
But it's because nobody buys based on price. They buy based on the price to value ratio. And I'll give you a good example. You can buy, for people who are old enough to remember what a Rolodex is. Rolodex was this thing you put on your desk, had little cards in it, and so each card had one contact on it, and you could, spin this little wheel on the side, and you could spin through all of these individual cards. You could buy a Rolodex for $25. It's going to cost you thousands to buy a CRM, especially with all of the software. But when computer CRMs, especially, when you could get these for, desktops and PCs, when computer CRMs became available in the market, even though they were, 100-fold, more than 100-fold more expensive than buying a Rolodex, everybody abandoned the Rolodex and bought the CRM because you've got, it might cost you 100-fold more, but you got 1,000-fold more value out of it. And it wasn't even a decision. And you see this a lot in technology where you're solving old problems, but with entirely new technology. And this is nothing new. This isn't an invention of the 2000s. If we go back to 1875, when the telephone was introduced, telephone was the hot, high growth technology in the 1870s. The only people who bought it were businesses in high density urban areas with central business districts. And the reason they bought telephones was because what they had done previously, they were interacting with other businesses. They were using runners, couriers, to send messages to other businesses. If you were a stockbroker in New York in 1875, which was a big business then, someone had to deliver you a slip of paper with their instructions. You then had to turn that into buy-sell instructions, have that piece of paper physically delivered to somebody on the exchange floor. It was all done by human runners with slips of paper. And suddenly with a telephone, even though the telephone was a lot more expensive than just hiring runners, because you could do that same work in a fraction of the time, you could do 100-fold more work in a day for a given person. Even though the telephone was extremely expensive, it was so valuable that everyone had to have one, or you didn't stay in business.
But like, there's the examples we're talking about. They're, iPod, the fax machine, electronic spreadsheets, phones. They're technological advances, and I get the point there. But there's still companies like retailers, as an example, that don't necessarily have, like, let's say a clothing store. There's not a technological innovation there, right? Like they're selling clothes to people in the market and they're making a profit off of that. So there's still, I guess the point around growth is that there's still growth available from a revenue perspective. But just to come back to the beginning, like what we're talking about is growth from like significant market share gains and dominating the market. And so like, it's not always necessarily about technological innovations or giant price to value ratio. Like it can just be also more availability, can it?
Yeah, but that's usually a small multiplier there. And a couple of examples. So one is if you go into a large U.S. supermarket, there'll be roughly 4,000 to 5,000 unique brands in that supermarket. So not counting differences in pack sizes and that sort of thing. 60 to 80% of those brands have never run a single advertisement in their entire history. And many of those brands have been around. There's all sorts of, canned vegetables that have never run an ad in their history other than having a label on a can on a shelf. And yet they've been around for decades. They're profitable businesses. They're perfectly good, stable businesses with no growth at all. So you can have an absolutely profitable, long-term, stable business with no revenue growth and no market share growth. So again, I think it's important to separate out. You don't have to have growth to have a meaningful, useful business. You don't even have to have marketing to have it. And we see that with a large percentage of consumer packaged goods. But usually, again, it's not a mistake when people talk about, when people go on about growth. And they're pointing to mostly technology companies, and they're not pointing to the dress shop down the street that opened an extra store, because that's not much growth and it's not that interesting. What you really are interested in is this sort of 10-fold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold growth. And that's really
these are like
hard.
The hockey shape curves that we're talking about, right?
Growth.
Like that's the kind of growth that we're trying to get to. Is what we're talking about.
But again, that's the growth porn industry, and they're cherry picking very, very specific examples, and it's not a mistake that most of those examples come from a very small number of categories and a very, very small number of brands. And I'll give you another example. This is on the consumer side. I gave two examples. So Warby Parker, the eyeglass people. So this is a perfect example of a physical availability play. That before Warby Parker, you had to find a local optometrist, to take your prescription to them to get that, some local shop to turn that prescription into a pair of glasses. And with Warby Parker, they're, I wouldn't say it was a brilliant concept, but they were certainly smart enough to be the first ones to do it, which was, let's just take the prescription online and we'll have one big central facility and we'll email you your glasses. And, and they underwent huge growth. So they had, a massive physical availability advantage, which certainly helps. So that certainly falls into the category of innovation. So innovation does not have to be in the product. It could be in the distribution.
Yeah.
But the real reason that Warby Parker grew is they raised $700 million. They had almost $1 billion to spend on letting everyone know that Warby Parker existed. So, their growth came fundamentally from raising a huge amount of external capital and generating a massive amount of excess share of voice to be able to then take that market away from the local optometrist. And then once they had the market share, this is the other part of the picture is that once Warby Parker had the market share, lots of other companies piled in. None of them have ever really been able to to push Warby Parker off the throne. And the reason why was that by the time the other companies piled in, even though Warby Parker had burned through their $700 million in outside investment, they had a very large market share, generating a lot of revenue just from ordinary sales of products to customers. And so they could continue to have a very, very high share of voice, because their share of voice is going to, unless you have outside money, share of voice is going to scale linearly with share of market. So because
usually there's a percentage of revenue is driving the share of voice part of on every individual brand.
Yeah. So your total amount of available cash is going to determine, you're going to be able to spend some fraction of that on marketing. And the question is, where does the available cash come from? It can either come from selling stuff to your customers, which is the way it is for 99.99% of businesses, or for roughly 0.02% of businesses, you go out and you raise a lot of capital. And, and then for a period of time, you can use that capital to essentially buy market share. But once you've got that additional market share, that translates to additional revenue, which means you now have, a sustained baseline of revenue that's at a higher level, that you can now have a sustained higher level of share of voice out in the market, and have more people be aware of you, and therefore be available to purchase your product or to choose your product over someone else's. But and a couple of other examples that's worth throwing out that just get repeated ad nauseum. Oatly, they raised $350 million. Gymshark, $400. So
a lot of this is this external, if it's not the technology or the product technology component and the price to value ratio, then there's some external fundraising that's superseding or
that breaks the underlying,
allowing them
dynamics.
To break through that percentage of revenue limiter, right?
So you've got to have something. Component. Yeah, you have to have something to break the stable market dynamics. And I'll give you another example. Salesforce. Salesforce did not raise a lot of money. They started very small. They were very underfunded for a long time. It took them 12 years to gain any substantial market share. So they were gaining a point and a half of market share a year for 12 to 14 years before they really kind of came on the scene. But during that period of time, the number one competitor in the space, which was Siebel, basically decided to pour gasoline over themselves and set themselves on fire. And so as Siebel was burning down their house, Salesforce was one of the primary beneficiaries of that. They were able to take in a lot of the market share that should have gone to Siebel if Siebel had not stumbled on the product development side. Siebel's problem was they were originally a mainframe company. So computer CRMs date back to the 1960s. Siebel was a pioneer starting about 1968 in mainframe-based CRM packages. Siebel was very late and stumbled very hard when they tried to make the transition to network PCs in the late 90s, early 2000s. And eventually, they ended up completely going under and getting bought by Adobe, which is the place where all good software goes to die. And so Adobe immediately started their typical product mismanagement process. And Siebel still exists today as Adobe CRM, but who's ever even heard of Adobe CRM? So it was Salesforce. I mean, a lot of Salesforce's success was that you had a very, very dominant player who basically surrendered market share through essentially failed product development strategies. And, so you had an opportunity for a highly aggressive competitor to be able to pick up that extra market share.
So I think there's three things so far that we've identified that are driving growth. There's the external funding, like excess external funding from, say, fundraising. There's the product innovation, price to value ratio on solving a problem. And then there's the last one around a competitor fucking up.
Right.
Even a Bud Light would be a more recent example.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, also, organic growth of the underlying category, which is often tied to innovation. That's often the net effect of the introduction of a major technical innovation.
And then, V, maybe you want to ask about the reach part here.
Yeah. When I was thinking, it's funny because there's a couple directions I wanted to go with this. Obviously, we wanted to get into the reach versus creative trade-off. Obviously, it's a big, important lever I think we as marketers have that we can use. When we think about this, there's the surface area of effectiveness, right? Which the formula there is what? Effectiveness equals creative effectiveness times effective reach gives you that surface area of effectiveness. Now, when we're thinking about a lot of these brands that you've been highlighting and you're talking about the use cases, reach differences between the largest and the smallest brands are often 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1. So while creative effectiveness only differs 1.5% times to 6 times, how would you look at, or how would you recommend marketers look at these two, I won't call them continuums, but these two levers that they have, and where should they be focusing their attention to ensure to help drive that growth or use as an accelerator?
I mean, and so if we look at the recent work that, comes out of Les Benet's work with the IPA database, what was it called?
Go big or go home.
Yeah, go big or go home. What he points out in that research is that 90% of a campaign's effectiveness is based solely on reach, not on creative effectiveness. But the problem is, if you are Salesforce, who is spending $14 billion a year on marketing, and you're trying to compete against them, with your Bob CRM, and you've got 500 customers, Salesforce is going to have a lot more money to spend than you will, to let people know that Salesforce exists and to keep reminding them that Salesforce exists. And so the problem is that reach is largely out of your control. Reach is a function of how much cash you have. So either you need to get a lot of market share, which means that you have a lot of cash flow from existing sales, or you need to get some outside venture capitalist or private equity firm to, come in and drop $200 million on you. But if you don't have any of those, if you're having to fund operations out of revenue, you're just not going to have much revenue to use to purchase reach, and you're not going to have any control over that. There's no way you're going to be able to spend 300% of gross revenue on marketing.
But in the Bob CRM case, then isn't creative the only one of the few levers that they actually have?
So this is why creative is important. Yeah, and people should never underestimate just how vital creative effectiveness is, not because it's effective, but because it's the only lever you can pull. It's the thing you get to control, even though it may only have 10% influence on how successful the campaign is going to be, but better 10% than 2%. So you want to pour a lot of energy into really good creative effectiveness, simply because it's the only thing it's the only lever you can pull. It's the only thing you have control over as a marketer.
So small brands can really only afford to do or go down this path of like really, really improving the creative outputs. Whereas large brands, they can just spend their way to prominence.
But here's the other, there's almost like a double jeopardy here, because not only can the large brands put their message in front of vastly more people, but because you're spreading that creative across 1 million people instead of 1,000 people, even very, very tiny improvements in creative effectiveness by the large brand is going to have a magnified effect, because if you've got a 1% improvement in creative effectiveness spread across 1 million people, that's a lot more than a 50% improvement in creative effectiveness spread across 1,000 people. And so the big brands don't have to spend that much effort at being more clever or more creative, because the mere fact that they can put that message in front of a lot of people, even tiny improvements, it will have outsized results. So you're really hit twice as a small business.
V and I've had a whole bunch of conversations recently around the quality of media placements. Yeah. So things like, I always laugh when I say this out loud, like a non-viewable impression, like is a bit of irony to me, that there's quality media placements that as a small brand, that is a lever, I think, where you can evaluate the quality of the media. So that when you're putting a good piece of creative or any kind of creative in a market, that actually this is being seen by real people.
I mean, this is true, but this is a lever everyone gets to pull. And it's not like, your small scrappy brand, is populated by a team of Einsteins, and your giant competitor, has their marketing team run by a bunch of orcs.
Yeah. I get it.
I mean, they're doing they're thinking the same thoughts around how to do media buying as you're doing. And in fact, they have a lot more resources to be able to do the market research, to better understand, what represents higher and lower value channels. So again, if you want to go hire Karen Nelson Fields, the expert in this, I can promise you she charges, I don't know how much she charges, but I can promise you it's a lot. And you're a lot more likely to be able to hire her if you're Salesforce than if you're Bob CRM, because you're not going to have enough money to pay her if you're Bob CRM. So again, channel effectiveness is a very important thing, but the bigger the brand, the more advantages they've got to be able to pay the for the market research to be able to make better media buying choices.
Okay, let me throw this up for you, because you had this shape of loyalty thing that we had a conversation about. I know V and I were talking about it too. Let's go down that path for a second as a thought experiment to explore. So if I don't have, if my competitors aren't orcs, and I don't have some kind of product innovation, and I don't have some external funding source that gives me an outsized advantage, and the category is not growing, then can I rely on loyalty as a path to growth? Can I get more rabid, loyal customers?
Well, so there's two ways to answer that. So let's start with, let's just assume loyalty works. Now, we're going to explain why it doesn't in a minute, but you don't even have to go down the loyalty isn't real argument to answer this question. Let's just assume that all of the crap that people pump out about loyalty really works. Loyalty is essentially about repeat buying, about getting someone to come back and buy you again instead of buying something from the other guy. If I've got 100,000 customers and you've got 10 customers, any kind of loyalty that you can do, I can do. But more fundamentally, I got a lot more customers to potentially try to find loyalty in than you do. So you're not going to be able to grow by being better at retaining your existing customers. Again, the one fundamental rule is brands grow by increasing market penetration, by going out and finding new customers that haven't bought from them before. You don't grow by taking a larger share of the market from, the larger share of purchases from individual customers. But the other problem in there is that, again, loyalty is ultimately about increasing the rate of repeat buying. Or at least that's the effect. I mean, loyalty, I think, is a bit more subtle than that. But the observable effect is a customer that bought from you before is more likely to come back and buy from you again. The problem with that is that we know from 70 years of research that individual customers have a relatively fixed rate of buying. So, if I'm buying laundry detergent, it doesn't matter how loyal I am to Tide. I'm not going to suddenly go from buying 1 box a month to buying 10 boxes a week. So you're not going to be able to increase my rate of consumption typically, unless you can introduce a technical innovation that radically lowers radically alters the price to value ratio. But you're typically not going to be able to get people to increase the rate of consumption. But the other problem is that we also know from decades of research that individual buyers have relatively stable sets of brand preferences, meaning that they will tend to buy from a repertoire of brands, and their individual choices in terms of how likely they are to buy brand A versus B versus C is relatively stable over time. But a much deeper and more fundamental issue is this thing called the zero choice rule. And this was originally developed by Andrew Ehrenberg back in the 60s. And the notion of the zero choice rule is that what the brand you chose the last time you went into the store has no bearing on the brand you choose the next time you go in. That there is no correlation between what you bought previously and what you buy the next time. And loyalty basically, this notion of trying to, quote, get more loyalty, it basically assumes that you can break that zero choice rule. Right. And we've got almost 60 years of really good research that says this never, ever happens. So back in 1972, there was a researcher that produced what was called the Hendry model. So this was an alternative model to the work that people like Andrew Ehrenberg were working on at the time. And the Hendry model basically assumes, sort of built into the model that your purchase choice for your next purchase occasion is correlated to the purchase choice based on your last purchase occasion. So if you bought Tide last time, you'll be more likely to buy it this time because you bought it last time. If you bought a smaller brand last time, you'll be more likely to buy that brand again. And, we've seen a half a century of research looking at the Hendry model. And 100% of that research says this is not how buyers buy. This is not how markets work. And so what happens is every purchase is a statistically independent event where the choice is drawn from the set of fixed brand preferences that someone has in their head. Now, a different buyer will have a different set of brand preferences. So I might like Tide and someone else might like Arm & Hammer or Gain or some other brand. And will tend to disproportionately buy it. But at the same time, if I go to the grocery store and they're out of Tide, I don't decide to just wear dirty clothes.
I still need dishwasher, or I still need laundry detergent. Yeah.
I will happily buy my second choice or my third choice. And if my second or third choice is a little bit on sale, I might buy it as well, even if there is Tide there. So our brand choices tend to be driven by these internal long-term preferences, not by what we did previously.
Yeah, so we loved your piece on the shape of loyalty. And there's one thing that I think I'd love to just quickly, because I know we're going to run out of time here. We always do. Is just around this idea that the shape of loyalty moves with market shares, like the underlining thing around the piece that you wrote. Why do we continue to treat it as an independent variable, though?
Hope. Yeah.
Good answer. That's one of the best strategies, right?
The power of fantasy. I mean,
I prayed last night.
So there are interesting cracks embedded in the very language of loyalty that's worth thinking about. So the moment that someone says we need to get more loyalty, that automatically implies that there are some customers that have more loyalty and some customers that have less loyalty. And the idea that we need to get more loyalty means that loyalty isn't some fixed metric among your buyers, but it's something that is a characteristic of each individual buyer, and it falls into essentially a probability distribution. So you've got this range of very, very loyal customers to very, very disloyal customers, with kind of a peak in the middle where most people will, buy you occasionally, but they won't buy you all the time. And you see this structure, if you look at this kind of range of loyalty for each individual brand in a category, and you add up all the pieces, what falls out of that is relative market share at the category level. So the fact that this comes as full circle back to brands don't grow. The fact that relative market share tends to be extremely stable over years and decades, even in fast growing categories, relative market share stays the same. I mean, look at Microsoft. The PC or the desktop software industry has grown 1 million-fold since Microsoft was founded in the 1980s or 1970s. And yet, Microsoft had the dominant market position in the early 1980s, and they still have roughly the equivalently dominant position today. So even in highly innovative categories that undergo absolutely massive growth, relative market share tends to stay fairly constant. And again, my own experience early in my career, with a category where in 5.5 years, we went through 100-fold growth, but every one of our competitors went through 100-fold growth. And at the end of that, everybody's relative market share was where we started off literally 10 years earlier. I mean, but even before I got involved. So the fact that market share remains extremely stable over long periods of time is an indication that loyalty is a very, very hard thing to alter. because it's not driven by your marketing. It's driven by people's brand preferences within the market. I'll give you two other examples. The number one in the U.S., the number one brand of laundry detergent is Tide, 40% market share. They've been the number one. They've had the number one market share position in that category since 1947. No one's pushed them off. If you look at toothpaste, Colgate had the number one market position in 1897. They held that to 1962 when Colgate overtook them with fluoride toothpaste. They held that until 1997 when Colgate overtook Crest. And Colgate has now had the top market share position since 1997. So, we're looking at 130 years with two brands that swap market share
dominating.
Yeah. And so that tells you that loyalty has to be extremely stable. Otherwise, we would see high degrees of volatility in relative market share between brands.
If we think about, there's a lot that we've covered, and we're trying to make this tangible for people, including myself. And I've told you before, running a lot, burning a lot of energy to stand in the same place is a thing that's been really aggravating my brain for a long time. We've had a lot of online conversations about this, but what do we do then? We have the tools that we have. For the most part, there's in a marketing perspective, or maybe a broader perspective, maybe it's through the 4 Ps or something. There's got to be a different framework than just run ads and then try and show an ROI to justify more budget. There's creative as a lever. What are the levers, I guess, that we can control, that we should be looking at?
Well, so there's sort of two parts to the answer there. So one is, advertising isn't the sole mechanism. I would say 60 to 80% of the 4,000 to 5,000 brands in a typical U.S. supermarket have never run a single ad in the entire history of the brand, often over many, many decades. So advertising is a mechanism for brand exposure. So we have lots of other mechanisms for brand exposure. So we've got word of mouth, we've got lived experience with the product, we've got incidental exposure. Every time you get out on the street, you're going to see a lot more Toyota emblems than you're going to see, Maserati emblems. Simply because there's a lot more Toyotas on the car because they have more market share. And so what happens is, all of these non-advertising based brand exposure mechanisms all scale with market share. If I have 100,000 customers and you have 10 customers, I have a lot more people who might talk about my product. I have a lot more people who might have once used my product and they're now at a new job. I have a lot more opportunity to randomly run into your product if there's that many people using it. And so this is the real problem we've got, is how do we increase brand exposure beyond what's already baked in based on our market share? And the whole advertising thing, if we the go big or go home idea of 90% of the effectiveness of a campaign is how much money you spend. Again, we don't control that. So that's really largely locked in by market share unless you have outside funding. And so, so if we think about the three levers to pull for making people aware of us, we can either spend more, we can have more effective ads, or we can place those ads in more effective channels. So the spending is largely out of our control. That's driven by market share. So that gives us two levers to pull. We can either make more effective ads or place those ads in more effective channels. And so creative development, media buying, the two big pillars of advertising. And the problem there is that anything that I can do to make a better ad, my giant competitor can do the same. Anything I can do for better channel selection, my giant competitor can do the same. So we're largely playing in the same, on the same playing field without any kind of exponential advantage there. But what is important is if I put everything into a really bad channel, I've put all my advertising in a highly ineffective channel, I'm wasting a lot of dollars. If I have an ad that is, so badly done that no one has a clue what I'm trying to sell them, I've wasted a lot of dollars. And so even though we have a maximum number of dollars that we can spend on reach, how effective those dollars are spent has a lot to do with how good how good the creative development process is and how good the media buying process is. And so what happens is you want to get as close to 100% effectiveness as possible with your creative and your media buying. You're not going to get 110% or 150% because because the money isn't there. But if you could get 95% of the way there instead of 50% of the way there, you now have doubled your effectiveness. And this is why this notion of marketing effectiveness is what really matters, not marketing efficiency. ROI is marketing efficiency. How many impressions do we get for the dollar? So you really want to be obsessed about how effective my channel choices are, my media buying is, and my creative effect, the creative effectiveness of the ads are. And not because it's going to give us a 100x leverage, but because it's going to allow us to squeeze the maximum amount of leverage out of the finite number of dollars that we've been given.
So I wrote a couple things down here as I was kind of going through this. So first of all, the spend more, it's kind of out of our control. Obviously, it's whatever an organization can give you. The more effective we can be in ads. So from a creative component where you're thinking about, being emotional, making sure that you're really landing your message with your audience. Then, of course, looking at those better channels. That's all table stakes, essentially, is what you're saying. And it feels like what we have left is we hope that our competitors are run, like Mark said, and you said earlier, run by marketers or orcs, if you will. And make sure that they're orcs consistently to give us a chance to
or get bought by Adobe.
Or get bought by Adobe.
Which is the same thing run by orcs.
It's kind of, it's making me think of like in medicine, the idea of the Hippocratic Oath, like to do no harm. The do no harm part is really critical because it's easy if you screw up without picking the right media choices and the platforms, and you screw up with your creative. Those are two really important parts for, I'm saying marketing departments, but I mean like more advertising. Those become really, really critical things that the advertising team has to get right. And if you do harm there, then you're doing a lot to service to the organization.
Well, I mean, I think the key thing is don't piss away the budget you've been given.
Yes.
Yeah. And the deal is scroll the feed on LinkedIn or on Facebook or on Instagram. And what you see is an endless stream of crappy creative, stuff that could have been twice as good as it is, 5 times as good as it is, but it wasn't because for whatever reason, because people aren't thinking. They're not putting the amount of effort into it. Although even there, one of the problems with creative effectiveness is, how there are 2 pathways to creative effectiveness. One, you're, a Picasso level genius and you can just, divine what millions of people will respond to. There are not many of those people out there. Likely, you're just an ordinary schmo, trying to create an ad. In which case, if you want a better ad, you got to test it. You got to have a mechanism to put it in front of a lot of people, along with other versions of the ad to see which version works. And so you have companies like System 1 that make, tens of millions, hundreds of millions from doing that. But who buys their services? The very, very largest brands.
The biggest brands,
Those services are extremely expensive. They're expensive in terms of the amount of time it takes. It's expensive in terms of what it costs the outside to purchase the outside service. And it's expensive in terms of, you're going to need to create 10 or 20 times as many pieces of creative so that you've got enough stuff to test and to iterate through before you get to the one that's good. And again, the ability to have highly effective creative is closely tied to your market share.
Right.
Because it means if you have more market share, you got more cash to pour into this, to invest into this, and therefore you're going to be more likely to be able to come up with better creative. And you can't rely on the fact that your graphic designer is the next up and coming Picasso, because that's just not going to work. So again, even on something like channel selection, the media buying side and the creative development side, companies with high market share have a substantial advantage over companies with low market share, simply because they have more resources to pour into making this stuff better. Because it doesn't get better just because you're sitting around ideating on it longer. It gets better because you're doing research to test and prove what works.
Sure.
What works on the channel level, what works at the creative level. And so this is tough for smaller companies.
Dale, this has been another incredible conversation, I have to say. And we keep doing this and we keep saying it at the end. Like, we just don't give ourselves enough time. How can people find out more about the work that you continue to do and some of the great pieces that you continue to write?
Pretty much everything I do is on LinkedIn. So I've been a bit off of LinkedIn the last couple of months. Actually, I've been down sick and it took a while to recover, and then I got way behind on work, and so I've been scrambling to catch up with the work, and so LinkedIn has had to kind of go, but I'm about to finally get caught up with things and get back on LinkedIn. So that's always the best place to find me.
Awesome. Thanks again for your time,
Thanks, Dale.
Absolutely. This is always fun.
If you like this show, please leave a review. And even if you didn't, we'd love to make this show better, and your feedback will help us do that.